So good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to host the very first event of the Council on Geostrategy. The newest foreign affairs think tank based in the heart of London and dedicated to making the United Kingdom, as well as other free and open nations, more united, stronger and greener. Within China, Xi Jinping, General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, seeks to forge new China man. Abroad, he could be said to be promoting a new China-compliant world. Just as CCP members do not dare, are not able, do not wish to be corrupt, Beijing also has been applying inducements and pressures to ensure that countries such as the United Kingdom do not dare, are not able, do not wish to go against the interests of the CCP. In the context of the recently imposed sanctions by the CCP against 9 UK citizens, including 5 members of Parliament, the question what the Chinese Communist Party wants from the UK and how should we respond could not be more timely. And I'm absolutely delighted to present our wonderful panel in today's discussion. Our Associate Fellow, Charles Parton, who has just published a new policy paper on what the Chinese Communist Party wants from the UK. Charles is one of the top experts on China in the UK, who spent 22 years of his 37-year diplomatic career working in or on China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. In 2017, he was chosen as the Foreign Affairs Select Committee's Special Advisor on China, and he returned to Beijing for 4 months as advisor to the British Embassy to cover the Communist Party's 19th Congress. I'm also very pleased to present our another prominent panelist, Professor Rana, who is a professor of the history and politics of modern China and also director of the university's China Center. He is the author of several books, including Modern China, A Very Short Introduction, and the award-winning A Bitter Revolution, China's Struggle with the Modern World. His most recent book, China's War with Japan, 1937-45, The Struggle for Survival, was named as 2013 Book of the Year in the Financial Times and The Economist, and was also named a 2014 Choice Outstanding Academic Title and won the 2014 Rusey Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature. And finally, we are joined by my brilliant colleague James Rogers. James is a co-founder and director of research at the Council on Geostrategy, where he specializes in geopolitics and British strategic policy. Previously, he held positions at the Henry Jackson Society, the Baltic Defence College, and the European Union Institute for Security Studies. So before we start, just a couple of housekeeping rules. Our panelists will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes overall, and in the second half of our hour, we will move to Q&A session from the audience. Mr. Parton will start with his presentation, and we will then move to a discussion between Mr. Parton and Professor Mitter. After that, we will hear Mr. Rogers, who will give his remarks on how Britain should successfully respond to the pressures from China. And finally, the event will end with the Q&A session. You can ask questions during the whole course of the event, but please do make sure to indicate to whom you are addressing the question. So without any further delay, Mr. Parton, the floor is yours.
Victoria, thank you very much indeed. And thank you to the Council on Geostrategy, both for commissioning the paper and indeed for organising today's events. And thank you to Rana. Rana, this is a sort of flashback for me, 45 years. You're sitting there, you read out your essay, the tutor then expertly fillets it and asks some horrible questions, and you leave the room at least with the upside of a nudge in the direction of on the road to enlightenment. But it's a daunting experience. Anyway, thank you in advance. The integrated view came out last week, and I think if it showed one thing, it was that the UK lacks a strategy on China and badly need one. Last year, I wrote a paper that put out a strategy, a UK strategy for China called Towards the UK Strategy and Policy for Relations with China. And so did Rana Mitter in conjunction with Sophia Gaston. And I highly recommend that you read Rana's paper. And it's not only for the suggestions on the strategy, but also because it's a very fine summation of how the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, operates, its interests, and a good background and history of the UK-China relations. This paper today which was published yesterday, is in a sense a prequel to those 2 papers because it considers the question of what the Chinese Communist Party wants from the UK. Both of our papers in last year considered that question, but I don't think that we did it in great depth. That wasn't the aim. A couple of precautionary remarks in advance. I always refer to the Chinese Communist Party, rarely to China or the Chinese government. This is in line with Xi Jinping's dictum that the party leads everything. But it's also a truth that the party hates because it's a deliberate ploy on the part of the party to mix up China and the Chinese Communist Party so that any attack or criticism of the Chinese party it represents as an attack on China and the Chinese people, and therefore can be said to be racist. So we ignore that. We talk about the Chinese Communist Party. The other point is that the paper concentrates very much on the Chinese Communist Party and governmental relations and not people to people. And that's, of course, in line with the fact that the Communist Party leads all. But let's remember that life does go on outside governmental relations. That may be the framework, but businessmen do business, students study, tourists tour, and that might be something that Rana, I know, with his background in education, etc., may well want to pursue. It's an interesting question also as to whether, as Xi Jinping ramps up totalitarian control, the degree to which what I've just said will stay. Looking at the paper itself, it's long, it's about 7,000 words, but I hope that it's digestible because I've broken it down into clearly headed sections. It starts with a look at the broader question of CCP foreign policy and its aims. For the party, the foreign policy, the whole purpose of it, the number one aim is to stay in power, and therefore foreign policy must reinforce party legitimacy. And it's worth noting that the party sees foreign policy very much in terms of struggle. That's the word that's used, and it's quite a strong word. It was Xi Jinping in his very first Politburo speech talked about that struggle and the need for Chinese socialism to take the superior position over Western capitalism in the longer term. And that theme continues with the latest sort of slogan is the East, i.e. China, is rising, the West is declining. It's very much competitive. I think there are three elements to Chinese foreign policy, if I may simplify it grossly. One is the economic stick and carrot, which we see deployed everywhere. Secondly, I think we should underline the importance of the United Front strategy and the external propaganda effort, which is vast and which helps those two aims progress. The paper looks very briefly at what Chinese foreign policy aims are. It runs through, and it does that by looking through a speech, an exposition that Yang Jiechi, who's the Politburo member in charge of foreign policy, gave just after the fifth plenum. I think it came out in November or December, his piece in the People's Daily. And he sees the aims as foreign policy as helping China's economic and social development, reforming the global governance system centered on the UN, unspoken in a way that more favors China. Thirdly, opposing unilateralism and protectionism. And fourthly, safeguarding sovereignty and what they call development security. So that's the sort of background. The paper, I then look at a small section on how important is the UK to China. I don't think we want to exaggerate it. We're not in the first division, but we're certainly in the championship division for reasons that I go into. And then I suppose the meat of the paper is what the party wants from the UK. And that I think one should divide into the positive aspects and the negative, i.e. what it wants and what it doesn't want. And in terms of what it wants, I think on the positive side, it has looked to the UK as a place where it can showcase important industries like the nuclear industry, telecoms, high-speed rail, because if the UK gets involved in those with China, that sends a good example to other countries around the world. I think that's running into a bit of problems at the moment, that particular aim. Access to the UK's innovation and science and technology is very important, as is investment, Chinese investment in the UK, which is much more focused than it was up until 2016, and I think, now concentrating much more on science and technology. The city is another area. Developing China wants to develop its own financial expertise and promote greater use of the RMB, the Chinese yuan. It wants also the UK support in maintaining an open and non-protectionist economic global governance system. The UK is very open in that way. And to some extent, I think it looks to the UK to share some experiences on reforms that matter to the Chinese Communist Party in urbanization, health, or social security. So that's on the positive side. On the negative side, one could say, well, anything that prevents those positives coming to be is a negative. But there are also issues that relate to what the Chinese call their core interests. So clearly Hong Kong is one of them. Xinjiang and our reactions to the genocide and crimes against humanity there, the passage of Royal Navy ships in the South China Sea and the upholding of international law as we see it. I think the pushback against Chinese Communist Party interference in the UK in our academia, our politics and our media is far from welcome. And I don't suppose the party welcomes in any way the increasing attention that our security services are paying to cyber and agent operations against the UK. And looking to the next decade, this current decade, then I think it's almost inevitable that two other issues will loom large. One is Tibet, as the Dalai Lama approaches reincarnation, and the other is Taiwan, and I'm sure we can talk about that. The paper then goes on to look and say, well, where is the UK now, and what position, and what's going to happen in the future? I mean, we're almost teaching, I suspect, on the Australian experience of entering the doghouse. I don't think we're there yet. I suspect that the Communist Party is waiting to see what strategy eventually the UK government does come up with, how closely we may align ourselves with the United States in dealing with China. And just possibly until the end of COP26, because climate change, etc., is a big issue for the party and its reputation at the moment. The paper then goes on to look at the toolkit for what happens when you do fall foul of the party. There's, of course, some breathtaking hypocrisy involved there in terms of accusations that the UK fails to observe international obligations, or it's the UK that's changed, not China. We're disregarding core interests. There's interference in internal affairs. We're politicizing things that shouldn't be. I look also, again, as I did in the strategy paper, just how successful such a strategy, the strategy of the CCP in putting us into the doghouse might be. I think there is good arguments to be made why the fivefold threat against our exports, investment, the City of London, tourism and students are not as bad as portrayed, and we can go into that if you're interested in that. And I think that the Communist Party underestimates the increasing value, the increasing importance of values, which I think was demonstrated this last week by the reaction to sanctions on various individuals and organizations, particularly in the academic field, with the reaction to Joe Findlay's Smith's treatment, brought out an awful lot of academics in support. And then one has the whole question of divergence and decoupling, which Beijing's actions may well push forward. Of course, all papers have to have recommendations, so there are some. Given that the paper is about what the Chinese Communist Party wants in the UK, I guess I could have addressed my recommendations to the Communist Party, but I don't think they probably would have paid much attention to them. But I've selected a few, some of which I think they all actually reproduce recommendations that both Rana and Sophia's paper and my paper last year put out. But in some, we desperately need to increase our knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party, both more widely and within government. I think it's urgent that we do a detailed assessment of what the costs might be of being in the diplomatic doghouse. As I said, I don't think they're as sharp as some people represent. And I think we have to ask ourselves anyway, how much we value, at what cost we are prepared to defend our values and our security. I make a recommendation about preparing for turbulence. That might be obviously in terms of dependencies upon China, but also short-term support for those who may be attacked in certain areas of industry. I think that it's very important also to get our protective measures in place, whether that's defending science and technology in our university and companies, if it's got use either for military or surveillance purposes. And I do think that we should urgently set up the Australian equivalent of a National Counter-Foreign Interference Coordinator's Office. So that's one in the recommendations. And finally, speeding up, deepening consultation with like-minded countries, particularly in the EU and in the Indo-Pacific area. Lastly, I'll just end with the thought that started it all, is that the UK needs a strategy. That goes back to what Rana's paper says and my paper says. You need a strategy because good fences make good neighbours. And I really don't think that the ambiguity that comes through in the integrated review is something that we can stick to, particularly if we aspire to some form of global leadership. Those who are following won't appreciate that ambiguity. So it needs to be a dynamic strategy and an adaptable one, of course. Things change, and it's got to be agreed across government, business, academia, the media, civil society, and clear to the Chinese as well. So I'm looking forward to reading the government strategy, which I hope is coming out next week. Probably not, but anyway, whenever.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, Mr. Parton. And Professor Mitter, I'm sure that you have a number of questions and also a number of remarks to give. So the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you very much indeed, Victoria. And I am both going to make a few comments on Charlie's thoughts and perhaps throw a few of them back to him, as he said, just to make sure that he stays on his very considerable toes. But also, I think both of us, or all of us actually, would very much encourage, we see there are more than 50 people on this call, and please do start putting in questions and comments, because I know that both Charlie and I would be very keen to make this as interactive a dialogue with everyone as possible. Charlie, first of all, thank you for setting out the ground so clearly. And I've had a chance to speed read the paper itself, and I'd recommend that others do so as well. I think it can be downloaded perhaps from the Council on Geostrategy website, and I'm sure will be made more widely available. And it's a very, very kind of timely set of questions that you're asking, because at the moment, in the UK, I sometimes like to say that we've gone, in the space of 2 or 3 years, from a period of ignorance/complacency about China to a period of massive hysteria without any intervening period of illumination or elucidation. And I think that the middle is very, very important. Of the many things that you said, I think one of the ones that we really should actually pay particular attention to is the idea that this is not, at least I would say, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this in a moment, Charlie, but I don't think we're in an apocalyptic moment. The universe is not going to end in the near future as relates to UK-China relations, or more broadly speaking, the way in which the liberal world and China are coming into contact with each other, although there is absolutely no doubt that there is a highly confrontational tone that's emerging. And, again, many of us will notice this morning, the BBC's correspondent, John Sudworth, who was based in Beijing, I think, until recently, has had to leave at short notice for Taiwan, and he's not the first journalist to whom that's happened. So this wider question of how we get to know about China, how we actually have information sources, we have to be aware that simply wishing for that is not enough. We have to be in a situation where China also plays up to the role that it has been stating ever since Xi Jinping's big speech at the 19th Party Congress in 2017, that it's looking to play a more global role, that it's looking to be understood by the world. Well, it's very, very difficult to be understood if you don't let the world come and ask you questions. And I do think actually next year's Olympics, which I think will actually be a really good opportunity for the world's press to be there in China when they go on and ask a lot of questions about things going on in China. So, China would actually do well to lean into that and make it an opportunity. But let's stick to a couple of thoughts about the UK and its changing relationship with China. The first thing that I think I would like to flag up is that in comparison to the level of challenge, as well as opportunity, and I think both are there, but there's no doubt about the challenges, the UK as a society is under-equipped in terms of knowledge. We put it more crudely and say we don't have enough Charlies out there. You know, Charlie has indeed spent decades of his life learning Chinese, getting to know China very well, understanding in intricate detail many of the things that happen, from, you know, the kind of political language to actually the really important questions, which you didn't even touch on actually, Charlie, but I think you're very expert on. We may get more on this, to do with the environment, the question of how COP15 and COP26 this year may be an opportunity to actually deal with the kind of global dialogue where the UK certainly has a role and China is going to be absolutely central. So as someone who works in higher education, and education more broadly speaking, I would say that we need to do an awful lot more in this country, and starting, you know, yesterday or last week, in terms of raising knowledge levels. Now, let me be clear what I mean by that. Of course, it can mean teaching more Mandarin language, and those of us who've spent time learning it will know that it's an immensely rewarding pursuit to learn Chinese. But let's be honest, for those who have a European language as your first starting point, and maybe if you're not in the first flush of youth, Charlie is of course eternally young, but the rest of us are sort of turning larger and grayer and so forth as we get older. Starting, you know, Chinese language in late life might be a rather daunting prospect, particularly if you're, you know, rather busy with your own business or a consultancy or law firm or whatever your particular line may be. So while that will be great, maybe it's something for the kids, that's not necessarily what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is getting to a level where some level of familiarity with what China is like, not just in terms of all the things which rightly we have to note and object to very strongly, such as the recent sanctions on academics and politicians, but actually things like day-to-day life. You know, what's it like to wake up and be in China on a day-to-day basis? To give you a point of comparison, I think that most of us have some idea about this for the United States. Now, the United States is a very different country from the UK, and as people pointed out, that we're sometimes divided by a common language. But the accessibility of America, because of television, because of culture, all those sorts of things, is something that we almost take for granted. I think at least the kind of middle class, and maybe not even just the middle class, but the kind of internationally oriented middle class of the UK. That's almost entirely untrue when it comes to China. The number of people who, you know, if I asked on this call, would have seen, you know, something, a major American series on Netflix recently, Mrs. America, so it was a recent one, relatively recent, which I thought was great. But the number of people who will have gone on YouTube and watched a recent Chinese TV series, which, by the way, almost all the big ones are available for free on YouTube with English subtitles. You don't need to know a word of Chinese to watch them. That is something that you find happening much less frequently. And if you want to just have some idea of what the place is like, particularly if you don't go there, if you don't visit it, if you don't have the language, it's a useful starting point. Or in terms of, you know, if you're going to read very large numbers of dry and more difficult tracts on contemporary politics, perhaps from some of the more turgid political thinkers out there who write for you know, major theoretical journals. And that's important to do. It's an important part of interpreting what the Chinese Communist Party is up to. But try, and this one you probably need someone to help who does read Chinese, but go on Chinese social media, which is again freely and easily available and full of all sorts of often quite, you know, witty, sometimes quite pointed commentary about what's happening in terms of politics in China. A surprise to many people is that, you know, and most people know, that huge amounts of things are censored. You cannot speak critically about Xi Jinping as the top leader on Chinese social media. It will be censored off in 30 seconds, assuming it gets there in the first place. But you can talk about changing laws. You can talk about all the things that on a day-to-day basis the Chinese think about, you know, everything from expensive mortgages in major cities, sounds quite British in a way, to changing divorce laws, to the changing status of professional women. You know, these are just things on the top of my head that I've recently seen that have been interesting. And for those who can't do that, there's a brilliant website, and I'll give a shout out, called What's on Weibo, translated into English, which talks literally about what people are talking about on Chinese social media. So that's just, you know, two examples. I'll give you plenty of others. My point being this: the Chinese middle classes know an awful lot about the UK. And as Charlie says, they have a lot of respect for it too. Recent polling by Ipsos Mori done inside China in 2020 shows that the United Kingdom has, amongst the Chinese middle class who were surveyed, an 81% favorability rating. More than 8 out of 10 people asked in Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing said that overall, yeah, actually they thought the UK was a pretty decent place. France actually scored slightly higher than that. And one of the reasons is the attractiveness of many of the more cosmopolitan parts of British public life. Higher education, certainly one of those. Again, people may not realize, but for the last 3 years, largely because of the deteriorating relations between the US and China, the UK has been the #1 country for the Chinese middle class to send their students to be educated. And by the way, I think that's great. And I would encourage even more of them to do it, because I think that by having that chance to educate the best and the brightest from China's young middle classes, doesn't mean they're all going to turn into liberals or Democrats or any of those sorts of things. The purpose of education is not to give anyone any particular political view, whether it's democratic or otherwise. It's to open up the possibilities of debate and discussion in a whole variety of areas. And that's one of the things, including on China, that the UK still does extremely well. And it's one of the reasons why we attract so many Chinese students in history, politics, and other subjects. So perhaps I'll throw this back to you, Charlie, but I guess the point I'm making there really is about not just lack of knowledge in the UK, but knowledge imbalance between the UK and China. The young, rising, savvy, cosmopolitan, not necessarily very liberal Chinese middle class know a lot about the UK. I would still wager that the vast majority of the middle class in the UK still really don't know very much at all about what China's like on a day-to-day basis. Your thoughts?
I agree, Rana, and I think it's dangerous, because at the moment there's a lot that's pumped out that's being negative about China. I mean, we saw the sanctions last week, and it's very difficult not to put that in a bad light. And again, you know, the whole COVID propaganda that came out, I think that was very instrumental in changing the views of the British people, the British Parliament, the British press. And then, of course, you know, you can carry on with Xinjiang. So it's all very negative. And, you know, in those instances, rightly so. But as you've pointed out, there's an awful lot of ordinary people getting on with ordinary things whose interests are not vastly different from ours. And we shouldn't sort of be too blind to both that enormous fact and indeed to the other aspects of global goods, areas in which we not only have to cooperate with China, but should do fairly willingly. You know, already I can see in the questions that climate change and COP26 is coming up. That's a very obvious one. Health is too. We've got the pandemic at the moment, but just wait. We really should be working hard together on things like antimicrobial resistance, in which China, I'm afraid, will be very instrumental in either causing or helping with it. So that is absolutely right. We need a lot more knowledge, but it needs to be balanced knowledge. And it goes to a sort of hobby horse of mine, is that we've got to have good relations with China, no matter what goes on, but not at the expense of our security, our own interests and our own values. That's a phenomenally difficult balance to make. I just make a couple of other quick points, because I thought that you raised a number of interesting things there. I mean, I do think it's very worrying that China is closing down in terms of the media, but more broadly than that, in the way that as scholars go to China now, they find it very difficult actually to have frank conversations with other scholars. And this is going to contribute to a lack of knowledge. And when there's a lack of mutual knowledge, it's much easier for mistakes to be made. And some of those could be quite serious. How does one go about that? Well, we can discuss this at length. The only point I would have made anyway is we really need to understand what the party thinks, what it's saying. Too often we go through third parties or fourth parties or fifth parties. Read what the party says. It's not that difficult. And you can, even if you don't read Chinese, stick it into Google Translate or one of these apps. Because I tell you, that's what I do. I can't get through the volume otherwise. It would take me too long. I'd only read sort of 4 or 5 articles a day instead of many more. But you know, it helps that I can quickly skim the article and say, no, this is not worth bothering to put through. But if it is, I then put it through and I can then look at the Chinese if it's a bit muddled in the translation. But read what the party says. It's not that much of a black box. And having read what it says, then temper that with, as Rana says, thoughts about what they're saying on Weibo, what actually they're thinking away from the officialdom, because quite often what is said isn't necessarily what's implemented. Sorry, that's a bit of a ramble, but hell, we're here to ramble.
No, absolutely, very much something to pick up on that front as well. Let me offer one more quick thought, and I see that there's a whole bunch of questions as well, which I'm sure we should get in here as well, but actually it relates, at least to some extent, my thought to some of the questions that are coming as well, Charlie, which is the experience of Australia has been that very strong economic dependence, particularly for export of goods, has been problematic or actually damaging for Australia, because it's now in the situation where essentially it's wine, it's lumber, a whole variety of different goods are essentially being denied access to China, and it's doing significant economic damage to Australia as well. I think that directly, sort of compared, that's unlikely to be a problem if the UK is seeking to increase its trading relationship with China, because we're more of a services economy than a manufacturing economy compared to to Australia, which obviously is dealing in a whole variety of areas like mineral ores, which are not so relevant for the UK. There are some things that we manufacture, which I think the Chinese would no doubt like to have, including in the high-tech area, but those are unlikely to be available for export. So that puts forward a different sort of problem. What I think is an interesting, and so far as I can see, not yet very carefully thought through question is, what is the best way to maximize the opportunity of trading with China while minimizing vulnerabilities? And when I say vulnerabilities, I don't just mean in terms of potential boycotts, but also what you've mentioned, which is values-laden issues in terms of not getting entangled in businesses that may cause all sorts of very understandable ethical backlashes back in the UK. Lawyers have been mentioned in the Q&A, not least because, of course, the sanctions against certain barristers last week. But it seems to me that one of the areas where China is very, very keen to expand is the Belt and Road Initiative, this well-known expanding of its infrastructural investment in a whole variety of parts of the world, from Southeast Asia through to the Horn of Africa and beyond into Europe. That's slightly changed form in recent months and years, because it's switched in some areas to areas like the rollout of healthcare and so forth, and away from classic infrastructure in certain ways. But one of the things that, of course, surrounds that is the need to have arbitration and law. One of the things that London actually does extremely well, and whose standards are highly respected in the outside world. To put it bluntly, an awful lot of international companies would be prepared to operate under law that's regulated by London rules, but not by law that's regulated by Beijing rules. And, that's just really a kind of realistic fact of life in that sense. So thinking about the specificities of, where there's vulnerability, where there's opportunity, is one of the things that I think is going to be a very, very urgent task for the UK, particularly, of course, in its post-Brexit global Britain incarnation. Where do you see, or rather perhaps I should ask in a more kind of, open way, do you see that there are opportunities as well as threats, and is one more dominant than the other?
I think that's a horribly detailed question, Rana. Let me, before I try and return to it, just a couple of comments on that. I mean, first of all, it goes to this question of Australia, significant economic damage, dependence. I question that. I think that actually work needs to be done, and perhaps one of the things I might do next is actually look at the amount of damage, because maybe Australia is in a rather strong position because it has it has a surplus with China, and China needs iron ore. It's got a food security problem. So what happens if you get into the doghouse? You get certain commodities and goods hit. Those are ones which are either symbolic or which are replaceable elsewhere, like wine, or it's very temporary. So you hit barley for a year, but actually Australia's not done too badly. Farmers switch very quickly, and barley that would have gone to Beijing goes into Jakarta or Korea or elsewhere, and displacement trade happens. So I think that's why I said in the paper, we need to look at the 5 areas where we're sometimes threatened by China and make an assessment. Investment's another one. The stock of Chinese investment in the UK is current, it was in 2019, I think the figure is 0.2%. Investment is not a charity. If we want money, it's very cheap at the moment. There's a glut of it. Are there greenfield sites that are Chinese? No. How many jobs have been produced? Actually, it's all the other way. It's investment now is focused on S&T that the Chinese need. So they need that. I think we need to get more balance about that. I could talk about the laws. Maybe we'll leave that for the Q&A. I just wanted to pick you up also briefly on Belt and Road, because this is always my bee in the bonnet. It doesn't exist. It's a propaganda slogan, and we really shouldn't use it. What does exist is Chinese globalization. And so this mystery about what exactly Belt and Road is no mystery if you just look at it as the areas where China is globalizing and is moving out. You know, on legal connected with the Chinese going out into the world, I think it takes two to tango, and as you rightly point out, I think many countries and companies would not be very willing to have their arbitration in Shanghai or in Beijing for very obvious reasons. So that may well be an area, but that, you know, is in threatening the UK with that, the Communist Party is threatening the people in third countries it does businesses with. So I wouldn't profess to be an expert in UK trade with China, or indeed the services industries. Perhaps it's something I should look at more closely. But I think that what has happened in many countries that have been in the diplomatic doghouse, it happened with the UK after the Dalai Lama, it happened with Norway 6 years, it happened with South Korea, it happened with Korea, and it's pretty, Australia's, I think its global export figures are down about 2% this year, but that's because of the price of iron ore. But anyway, most countries, their exports rose during the time they were in the doghouse. So the bark is definitely worse than the bite. Chinese, companies, they buy because the goods or services are fitting for their purpose, a good price, maybe because it's an excuse to visit London and see their child at your university. There are, a whole reasons, and business goes on, but is only affected, I think, in those areas which have political resonance. And that, of course, is part of what happens when you're subject to the Communist Party's threat. Politicians get terribly excited because their visit or their telephone calls or whatever to Beijing is cancelled, and this is a complete tragedy. Well, actually, there are still hundreds of thousands of Chinese students studying in the UK. Business goes on. Ministers and their visits, they're important, I don't deny that, but they're icing, they're not the cake.
Fair enough.
Thank you so much, Professor Mitter and Mr. Parton. So James, we've heard a lot of fascinating thoughts, and now we'd like to hear from you. So how should we respond?
Well, I'll keep my comments very, very short so we can move quickly on into the question and answer session, because I think Charlie has outlined many ways that we can respond to this in his paper, and I'd urge everyone to go and read those. He's even mentioned some of those, and Rana has also mentioned a number of issues as well. The only things I want to say is I think we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of going into the diplomatic doghouse. We've been told for many years that we should favour better relations with China come what may, but this may not necessarily be the case. Particularly because of the integrated review that was published just over 2 weeks ago, which outlined 4 to 4.5, I would say, key objectives that the UK seeks to achieve in the world over the years ahead. These being, of course, the movement towards an open international order, enhanced collective security, the pursuit of democratic sovereignty, and greater technological leadership. And on top of that, an understanding that the Indo-Pacific region and the UK's tilt towards this region has to be broader than simply China. And I think the second major reason why we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of moving into the diplomatic doghouse, and also connected to that, the fact that we need to seek relations with countries in the region broader than only China, is, and also Charlie has cited this or mentioned this, and that is that China's power and reach, particularly over the UK, shouldn't be overstated. First in terms of investment, but also I think in terms of our allies and partners, of which we have many, and maybe China has very few. So the Prime Minister has stated, as has the US President over recent days, that it's a case of working with various allies to ensure that the international order remains open. And we have a number of different partners that are growing, such as Japan, Australia, India, in the region. And there is a great deal that we can do to work with them to ensure that our objectives are upheld. And therefore, I suppose this brings me in full circle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't need better knowledge of China. And I think in this case, Charlie's paper and some of the work that Rana has done help us to achieve that. So I would urge you all, if you haven't already, to go and read our amazing paper, What the Chinese Communist Party Wants from the United Kingdom. It's on our website. And that's all I think I have to say at this point. We can now move swiftly into the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, James. So let's proceed with the Q&A session now. So the first question from the audience is for Mr. Parton. So Charlie, you've mentioned deepening thinking with like-minded countries such as the EU. To what extent do you think the recent cliff edge-esque deterioration of the UK-EU relationship will affect a united front against the myriad threats from China?
Well, it's a very good question, of course. I worked in the EU delegation in Beijing. I think the first thing to say is that, and this comes from a Brit who's talking about unity and the EU in the same sentence. Well, yes, sorry about that. But having worked in the EU delegation, of course, the 27 countries are not at all united on China. But I hope that they're becoming more so. I think it's extremely important for us to put aside any recent past, and indeed current disagreements over vaccines, etc. This is just too important. The Communist Party is very adept at dividing and rule, and one of the ways of reinforcing our own security and our own interests and our own values is by working much more closely together with countries. So, France, Germany, Sweden, Poland, countries that are in mid-sized powers like us, we should be working much more closely with them, with the EU as a whole, which in some ways has been ahead of us actually in terms of looking at strategies towards China and putting out suggestions. It doesn't have the power to tell its members what to do in terms of the sort of CFIUS, the protection of your own science and technology in terms of buying up companies, mergers and acquisitions, but at least it puts out some sensible recommendations. So this is going to be ongoing. Look what happened over the sanctions with the EU. Very interesting question as to why the Communist Party did what it did to Europe just at the time when the comprehensive agreement on investment is being considered over the next year or so. I'm happy to go into some speculations on that. But yes, I think it's a really important that we do work as closely as we can with those countries in Europe that are seeing things through our light. One or two don't. But actually, I think that even in the Central and Eastern Europe, the 17+1, which is now 16+1, as Lithuania has basically moved out, the disillusionment has set in with China's performance, and that is something that, without being strident about, we need to work with.
Thank you, Mr. Parton. Another question is for Professor Mitter. How can the UK do a better job of leveraging the knowledge of China that already exists? There are quite a number of students and migrants from Hong Kong, many Chinese speakers in the UK too. What are your thoughts on this matter?
It's a really good question, and it is a reminder that actually it's not as if we lack resources in many of these areas, it's just that we don't make as good a use of them as we could possibly do. And in addition to the ones mentioned in the question, I would give one particular example. I mean, I can do it this because actually it's not my own institution, so I have no particular dog in the fight. SOAS, the major study centre for Africa and Asia, broadly speaking, part of London University, is in a state of permanent financial crisis. There are countries around the world that would give their eye teeth to have an institution with the standing and history and capacities of SOAS, which doesn't just teach Chinese and Japanese, although it does do that, Arabic as well, but also actually has remaining capacity in a number of relatively smaller, but nonetheless very important languages. Vietnamese would be an example of that, which are going to be of immense importance as we come to engage with the wider world. But as it is, as far as I can tell, that institution seems to spend most of its time, looking down the back of some kind of governmental sofa for the odd few pennies to keep itself together under threat of closure. It doesn't seem to me that that sort of national asset, which actually is a huge international asset, is being particularly well used in that sense. So I think that it's a good idea to look at all those areas where we do actually have that knowledge of China, and then bring it together in a variety of areas. So I think that the answer is that there's no one simple way to do it, but I think that we could certainly have more coverage than we do at the moment in terms of media. And this is difficult to do because on the one hand, you have a Chinese media establishment which is very keen to try, not just in China, but globally, to control the way that China's talked about in the outside world, good stories only, nothing bad. It's also, of course, making it harder for people to actually report from within China as well. So I do not underestimate the difficulties of actually telling a story about China in the Western world and in Britain in particular, which on the one hand, is in depth, it's based on knowledge and understanding, but also necessarily both has objectivity and brings up the fact that there are a whole variety of values that will always be part of what we do here, including difference of view, diversity, strong criticism of things that we find problematic. We criticize the Chinese government just as we criticize our own government. These sorts of things, I think, need to be applied more broadly speaking. But I would say that, if it is the case that we can, admittedly partly because of English language, spend an awful lot of our time in Britain thinking about America, even though we are not in America and we're not Americans, and we do a frankly less good job, but something of a decent job in terms of trying to understand what happens with our nearer neighbours, although perhaps if we'd understood them better, we wouldn't have separated from them quite so recently. I would still say that in terms of China, it's both a more difficult task and it's a task that has become more urgent because it goes back to the first point that I made in the conversation with Charlie. Right now, we just don't have that many avenues, that many forums, that many set of possibilities in which that wider set of understanding can take place. And the toughest thing, just to finish this thought, but I think it would be valuable if it could be managed, and it needs work on both sides, and the Chinese side is equally guilty on this, to find ways to have genuine dialogues. And by dialogues, I don't mean both sides spouting their own propaganda nostrums at each other, which is what these sorts of things often tend to be. Possibly in private, possibly places where people can actually sit down, maybe, with drinks, with a sofa, with the door closed, without anyone tape recording, and actually say what they really think. That, I think, has a great deal of value. It's very tough to do, but it's not impossible. I would certainly look in that direction in terms of where effort could be placed.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitter. Another question is for Mr. Parton. How do we get a consensus within the UK about what to do on China? It looks like the parts of the businesses and academic community are not entirely on board with the robust stance taken by the Parliament in the recent months. What are your thoughts on this matter?
That's a tough question. The first thing I think we need to do is at the governmental level to get unity. And that clearly has been lacking in the past. You only have to look at the flip-flops that have happened on 5G to see that. So that's why both sort of Rana and Sophia and I have been talking about and calling for a strategy so that it's set clearly and that there is consistency throughout. I think it's also very important to set up the structures to help with that. Again, in an earlier paper with some others, we set forward the need for the Chinese, the equivalent of a Chinese leading small group on for the UK on China, which was sort of. But that's across government. But I think once government is, and government's not going to make those sorts of arrangements and strategies without talking to business and academia and everyone else. So there needs, I'm looking at this, of course, very much as an ex-government official from a government point of view, but government needs to pull all those in and get consistency. But at the end of the day, there is always going to be some tension between your interests, your values, and the fact that you wish to earn money from the biggest market in the world. That is inevitable, and there's going to have to be some pain and as well as some gain in trying to get that balance right. Again, sorry if I'm being a little bit vague in this, but it goes back to what Rana was saying about knowledge. The more knowledge that the various constituencies have outside their constituency, then the more understanding they will be of other views and the need sometimes to shade their own positions. I think it's, again, one of my personal bees in my bonnet is, isn't it appalling that the UK has no proper think tank on China? How little expertise there is. There should be one. Germany has MERICS, and that, of course, has been sanctioned by the Chinese in the last few weeks. So I'm not sure that I've fully answered your question. As ever with these things, the brain doesn't work as quickly as it should. But if you want to come back at me, please do. My email address will be available or can be made available, and I'm always happy to debate with people these questions, because that's the way one learns more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parton. Another question is also for you. Balancing risk while maximizing opportunity is what all countries are trying to achieve with China. Speaking out on values is part of balancing risk, but as we can see from the last week or so, the CCP has doubled down on its belief that there's no problem in Xinjiang. That naturally leads to more tension. In your view, does this inevitably lead to a tipping point where the UK-China relationship has to change more fundamentally?
Well, I think it has changed fundamentally, and it's going to continue to change fundamentally. Yes, I don't think the CCP has got its mind around the fact that values really are now becoming a lot more serious, and that we are beginning eventually to look at how we deal with China and make decisions on it. And that, I think, it means that there will be changes. For me, it reinforces my view that we need a dynamic, adaptable strategy for dealing with China, and they need to know what it is, because the world is changing. We hear a lot about the D word, diverging or decoupling. I don't want to use the word decoupling, but we have to use the word diverging, because that is what is happening. But we need to try to minimize it, because there's so much that we need to work with China on beyond trade and investment, global, and all the other global goods. But at the same time, we've got to protect our own national security and our own values. So is that a tipping point when we set those out clearly and say to the China, look, these are the areas where we really can cooperate with you, and it's to our interests, both of us, and these are the areas, I'm sorry, where it's just off the menu. It is in your country. You wouldn't allow us to do certain things in your country. We have to accept that we go separate ways and be mature about it. But we have to get on because there is so much, like COVID, like AMR, like climate change, like development, like peace, that we've got to talk about. Will the Chinese Communist Party accept that change? They'll fight about it and make a large noise about it. But I personally believe that if you set out your ground clearly and you are unyielding, they come to respect that more than if it's fuzzy, it's doubtful. Sometimes they win, sometimes they don't.
Thank you, Mr. Parton. Beijing has stated policy that it intends to reunite independently guarantee Taiwan with mainland China and reserves the right to use military force if necessary. How do we dissuade China from such attempts to invade Taiwan? And also, more importantly, how should Britain nurture a relationship with Taiwan, an island nation with real geostrategic significance?
Well, I have thoughts on that, but maybe since I've done the last two, Rana can start, and then I'll have a go.
Yeah, sure. No, not hearing the voice. I was assuming they're there for Charlie, but I'm more than happy to step in at this point. Well, first of all, it's really important to note that actually the UK, like a lot of other countries, already has important relations with Taiwan in a whole variety of areas. For those of us in education, it has been for decades and remains an immensely important place, for instance, for language training. Those of us of a certain generation went first to the Guoyuzhongxin, as it's called, the National Language Center at the Taiwan Normal University. And this is something that actually an awful lot of people will have had as part of their training in that relatively small group of people in the UK who've gone through the kind of deep study of Chinese language and culture. Even now, historians like me, well, first of all, historians like me would find it very difficult to do our work on early 20th century China without access to the now fantastically digitized collections of the Academia Historia, the Guoshiguan in Taipei, the Institute for Modern History, and other institutions. And something else, which I'm going to say it's a little secret, but it's not a secret at all. It's actually quite well known. The other group of people who really benefit from that is mainland Chinese students who are also perfectly able to download large numbers of documents provided for them by the Taiwan authorities online, and they use it to write their doctoral theses as well. So if anyone tells you there's no mainland Taiwan cooperation going on, certainly in the field of education and study, don't believe a word of it. I say this by way of pointing out that actually the relationship between the mainland and Taiwan is quite complex. It's more complex than the headlines sometimes make it appear. The headlines are important. I don't think anyone who understands the region would doubt that the temperature has gone up in the Taiwan Straits in the last year to year and a half in some ways that are potentially immensely dangerous. And a lot of us who are kind of, geekily look at these things, keep on looking at whether the Chinese whether the National People's Congress, for instance, most recently talks about the Heping, peaceful reunification of Taiwan, which is a very important element in that discussion. I think the most recent statements actually have maintained that particular statement, but it hasn't always been there in the last year or so. But there are an awful lot of people involved in business, involved in education, involved in a whole variety of areas who do take part in that wider nexus that exists between Taiwan and the mainland too. So do remember that both sides of that exist. Now, the question about the UK. The blunt answer, I think, is that the UK on its own is not in a position, I think, to have a terribly major input in terms of the question of Taiwan. What it is in a position to do, and I think this is a perfectly valid thing to do, is to push very hard for the idea that peace and peaceful resolution of any issues is the only way that the whole of that region can possibly be maintained. The idea that there is some sort of future for a military recapture of the island, or in general, a sense that an all-out war in the Taiwan Straits and on the island would do anyone any good whatsoever, including China, is, I think, really unthinkable. And one of the questions, I've actually got it in a newspaper piece for the South China Morning Post, which you're welcome to find online. I've even put this to some Chinese diplomats and never got a terribly clear answer, is, yeah, supposing you invaded Taiwan, which, by the way, is not that easy to do. If you look at the military strategy on this, it involves an awful lot of quite advanced equipment, not all of which China necessarily has, and which would take, a significant sort of campaign. But supposing you did, what happens the next day? I mean, it is arguable that perhaps the current government in China is happy to have this sort of massive military encampment in which every single one of the 23 million people in Taiwan, most of whom would be opposed to an invasion, would basically sit tight at home and, refuse to say a word about it. But Taiwan is not Hong Kong, and indeed Taiwan has looked at what's been happening in Hong Kong and become very, very nervous about that. So I would say that Britain, let me finish this thought by saying, I think Britain could help to contribute to the following conversation, which is really one between China and Taiwan, but one important to the rest of the world, which is, when will Beijing come up with a really clear statement of why reunification is a good idea for Taiwan? We hear a great deal about why it's great for Beijing. It finishes the last unfinished business of the Cold War. The idea of territorial unity above all is clearly at the moment a very powerful one, although Mao didn't do much about it in the 60s and 70s. But the argument about what's in it for Taiwan, they used to actually make the case in certain ways, but you haven't heard very much about it recently. And I think if Beijing wants to raise its game, then actually being able to make that case and pushing them in that direction is something that actually the Western world could talk about. I think that's something that's perhaps more productive than the idea that this is about to become the next military flashpoint in the region, and indeed potentially globally, which strikes me, I think strikes anyone sensible on any side of the fence as being an absolutely appalling outcome.
I realise, Victoria, we're getting near the end of time, but just very briefly to follow up on that. First of all, I don't think invasion is at all likely. Not just militarily, etc., would be thoroughly difficult, but imagine the consequences. Immediately followed by sanctions, a drop in investment, not just Taiwanese, but everyone, trade, which would lead to unemployment in China, which would be, with the lack of a social security system of any great note, would lead to protest on the streets and an attack on the party. It would be a disaster for the mainland. But that's not the point. What they're trying to do is convince people that unification might come about through that, as part of the attempt to break the will of the Taiwanese people, etc. What should the UK do about it? I think that both UK and like-minded countries should make it very clear to China, maybe our government has quietly, that the moment that they either invade or destroy the lives of 24 million people who have chosen freely their system is the moment when we break relations and we impose sanctions. It would be a disaster for us. It would be a disaster for Taiwan. It would be a disaster for the mainland. But let them know that well in advance in order to prevent them doing so. In the meantime, the line against us on Taiwan has been getting stronger and stronger. The 2008 white paper on the EU had some pretty strong language in it out of Beijing. But I think that we should not be put off by this normal bullying. We should quietly do precisely the opposite of what they've been doing in the South China Sea and elsewhere in terms of salami slicing. We should build the salami quietly, very small little measures to strengthen our ties with Taiwan. We talk about the values in Xinjiang and what's going on there. I wouldn't want to put just a simple numerical figure on it, as it were, consideration of it, but 12 million Uyghurs, there are 24 million Taiwanese. And I think that we have a duty to preserve those values. They are, as it were, and geopolitically highly important. And on the past the Niemöller line, if they go and no one speaks out, then who's the next? And they don't speak out. Eventually, you come to yourselves. So, no, I think it's important to build that salami slice and strengthen quietly relations with Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parton. It is unfortunately already 2 p.m. and we have to end our incredibly interesting discussion today. We've heard about what the Chinese Communist Party wants from the UK, the implications of its current actions in the international arena, and also how we should respond. The recently published paper by Charles Parton can be found on our website, so please make sure to visit it and to download your copy. I would also like to sincerely thank all our panelists and the audience, and I do hope that you have enjoyed this wonderful event. We have now kickstarted our event program, and we will be bringing you many more timely and important discussions on geostrategic challenges and environmental security matters. You can check the upcoming events on our website, and you can subscribe to our events on our website as well. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you, everyone.